Hey guys, my name is Jonathan,
And I'm Deborah.
and we're here to tell you a little bit more about what we believe. So today we have the honor of having Dr. Hosmer with us. He was my professor in engineering for a long time. Dr. Hosmer, I don't know if you want to give us a quick introduction.
Sure.
Background.
Yeah, I'm Dominic Halsmer. I've been teaching engineering here at Oral Roberts University for 30 years now. I'm a senior professor of engineering. I teach mechanical engineering, got my bachelor's and master's in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Purdue University in Lafayette, Indiana, where I was born. And I got my PhD in mechanical engineering from UCLA in Southern California, where I worked in the aerospace industry for several years at Hughes Aircraft, and then came to teach at ORU. And I've always had a strong interest in science and faith issues. So I started working on a master's in biblical literature to help me understand the science and faith issues better, and finished that up a few years back, probably about 7-8 years ago. I finished my master's in biblical literature. So that's really helped me in wrestling with the issues that come when you try to interface science and scripture.
Well, actually, that's kind of the topic of today's conversation. So the question I want to ask you today is, can the theory of evolution coexist with Christian beliefs? So with that, there's a lot of different questions that come with young Earth, old Earth, fossil records. How does that, six-day creation, how does that fit into the Bible that we're given? Can they coexist?
Right. Can evolution coexist, or would you say coexist with a Christian belief?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question that really, I think, is on the front edge of a lot of young people's minds today as they go through their schooling, whether it's a Christian schooling or a public schooling. They learn about evolution, and it's taught, I think, in such a way which, from a science perspective, in a science classroom, it's taught from a scientific perspective, and really there's no room for speaking about God in that context, since it is a science classroom. So they're wondering, I think, is a great question. And the first thing we have to do is be careful to define our terms so that we all know exactly what we're talking about, and we understand them as the same thing. And this is a big one with the word evolution. So we need to stop and say, okay, what do we mean by that word evolution?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's got like 5 or 6 different definitions. It can mean change over time.
Yeah.
I mean, you can use it to describe stellar evolution, which is a well-known transformation that occurs within stars. And this is how we believe our chemical elements came into existence in the interior of stars under the hot, high-pressure environment there. We get things like carbon and nitrogen, oxygen. So stellar evolution is one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you're thinking about biological evolution.
Yeah.
And again, you can define it as just change over time. But usually what people mean when they ask this question is evolution in terms of life forms on Earth that have progressed and changed through mutation, changes that occur in natural selection, that certain environments will cause some life forms to survive and others not to. And so you have some selection occurring there. To the extent that you have this common ancestry or common descent among all living creatures, that's how I think the scientific community, and probably what Christians are wondering about in this kind of context, is common descent, common ancestry, this idea that there's this physical connection among all living creatures. Is that contrary to the idea that God created mankind and the worldview that we see coming from the Bible? So one of the first things you would do to answer that question is you would look at the Bible and you would ask yourself, okay, what does the Bible require in terms of what we believe? And this is where I think it can get a little bit tricky, because there's some interpretation involved when it comes to the book of Genesis, and in particular the first 3 chapters of Genesis. I mean, when we read the gospel accounts and we see accounts of the resurrection of Jesus, it's pretty straightforward how to interpret that, because those are historical records.
Yeah.
Those are eyewitness accounts of historical events. It's clear there's no question. I mean, there's no poetry or anything, poetic elements. It's clear how to interpret those. Jesus literally rose bodily from the grave, and we have eyewitness accounts of that. But when you look at Genesis 1, it's a little bit different. It's ancient Hebrew literature that probably came from oral tradition all the way from Adam and Eve, And so it was passed along orally for many, many generations and eventually written down. And it's a very fascinating piece of literature because it contains some poetic elements. We see some parallelism, which is characteristic of Hebrew poetry. The first 3 days, the spaces are created. The next 3 days, the spaces are filled. And we see what the function of those living creatures are that fill the spaces. And I know that some Christians like to interpret Genesis 1 as literal 6 consecutive 24-hour periods of time, and that is a possibility. But from my studies and my experience in a master's degree in biblical literature, I have come to understand that that is not the only option. The Hebrew word yom there can mean a longer period of time. It can mean 24-hour periods. It can mean the daylight hours. So I think that Christians, and in particular young students who are Christians, need to be aware that there are other options besides the 6-day, 24-hour interpretation of Genesis. Now, the reason I say that is because I'm also familiar with the scientific evidence, and we have a significant amount of evidence for an ancient universe that's about some 14 billion years old, and the Earth being some 4 billion years old. There's elements within the creation, the rocks, the radioactivity within the rocks, and core samples from the Earth and things like that that give us indications of much longer periods of time than just thousands of years.
Yeah.
So I don't think, I mean, Genesis certainly gives us important theological truths, but I don't think it was intended to give us all the details and the timing of the creation, of exactly how and exactly when God created mankind and how he did it. I think that it's left open. The biblical account leaves that open in terms of those details. And so I think, if we believe that God spoke the creation into existence, then that's also a form of God's word too, isn't it? And so the creation itself speaks of God, and it speaks of his revelation to us. And even the Bible invites us to look into the creation and see what it says.
Yeah.
The heavens declare the glory of God. So when we look at the creation, we see evidence for longer periods of time. We see evidence for a physical connection among living creatures. Now, to what extent, it's still an open question, but I'm open to the possibility that God might have used evolutionary processes, and when the time was right, breathed his spirit, the image of God, into a primate, and that became Adam, the first man, and Eve, the first woman. Nobody knows all the details of exactly how that happened, but I think they are compatible. In fact, I just read a really good book by a philosopher and a theologian, Rope Kayonen, who the title of the book is The Compatibility of Evolution and Design. So he believes they're both compatible with each other. And so I think that an evolutionary kind of creation is compatible with a Christian worldview, even a biblical worldview.
It's really interesting. I think I've always kind of agreed with that too, because I don't know, it's hard to say it happened exactly this way, because we're not God. We weren't there when it happened. But we can say, we can leave the options open. And honestly, I've always thought, I don't know if this is a weird way of thinking, but I always thought it's kind of arrogant to say, exactly how it happened, because I'm not God, I'm not all-knowing. And maybe it's not even within the realm, like within my realm of understanding, to even understand how it happened, how God would have created the world. So I think that's really interesting that you, at least you open up that option.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm same thing as you. I definitely think that there's so much we don't know, and there's so much that's we never will know until we get to heaven and can ask God face to face. But I have always been a little bit more leaning towards maybe a bit more against the idea that we would be created as a lesser form and then like evolved through natural selection and became something that we are today, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So because I just, like, for me personally, what I struggle with is I just don't see the point. Like, why would God have not just created us as we are now? Why would he have created us as a lesser form and then, you know, eventually we became what we are now? And it's not that I'm not open to the idea that there is like a different way of thinking, but I'm like, I guess that's where my confusion lies. Like, what would the point be for that process, if that makes sense?
That's a really great question. Why did God take so long to create everything? And why didn't he just create everything miraculously? It's a really good question. And I don't know that I know the answer to that. I could say a couple things about it. To me, one of the beautiful things that God has given us is the joy of discovery.
Yeah.
And discovering natural processes that display God's glory, I think, is a part of that. Johann Kepler, when he discovered back in the 1600s, discovered the elliptical orbits of the planets around the sun, he said, you know, this is like thinking God's thoughts after him. And especially as an engineer, that excites me because I see God as an engineer. I can relate to God because I'm an engineer and he made me in his image, and I must maybe have been given a little bit, tiny bit of the fraction of creativity and knowledge that God has to be able to kind of be in his image. And so it allows me to relate to God in a way which I wouldn't otherwise. So this practice of science, I think, was intended by God for us to know him better and to know his truths that he has set in place in the universe. And as Christians, this idea that we are committed to truth is a key and important idea. As we know, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So anybody who's committed to the truth, hopefully will find Jesus through all of this process of searching. And as Christians, we need to be careful that we uphold this idea of truth wherever we find it. Biblical truth, yes, but scientific truth also. We should be careful before we just wave it off and say, no, it doesn't fit with our particular interpretation of Genesis, therefore it can't be true. Maybe we need to reconsider our interpretation.
So I think I would be kind of curious to know like a few of the things that do point towards, an older Earth, and that do point towards an idea of a simpler life form that eventually became what we are right now.
And the idea that you mentioned also of at some point God chooses to breathe life into how would that interpretation, how does that interpretation work, do you think?
If you look at the Genesis account, you can see where God took the man that he had made and placed him in a garden. It's kind of unclear in that statement where he originally took the man from and when he made them earlier, before he put him in the garden. But there also is a place where it says God created mankind from the dust of the earth. So, when I first read that as a child, I thought, oh, God made a mud pie man, or he breathed life into him. And maybe that's how it happened. But consider that in the book of Job refers to God making him out of the clay. He formed me out of the clay, the dust of the earth. Now, we think Job came from his mother, out of his mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we don't take that part literally when Job says, you formed me out of the clay or the dust of the earth. So we should be careful on how literally we take passages, especially when the genre is such an interesting poetic kind of genre that we see in Genesis 1. Now, with regard to the evidences for an ancient universe, evidences for an ancient earth, we have developed incredible tools like telescopes that allow us to see vast distances in space.
Yeah.
And we are in a venue on Earth here, in the galaxy that we have here, that allows us visibility of vast distances. And the funny thing about starlight is it travels at a finite speed.
Mm-hmm.
So when you are viewing something that is emitting light, you have to take into account the travel time of that light.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when you look at the sun, you're looking at it when it was 8 minutes ago. You're not looking at it instantaneously.
Right.
So this has given us a lot of information about the age of stars and the age of objects in the universe. And we've come to understand the generations of stars after the beginning, what they call the Big Bang. I think it's just a description of, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about the Big Bang is it appears to be a creation event where all matter, all energy, even the dimensions of space and time, sprang into existence in a moment and expanded under this precise balance of the self-stretching property of the universe, which they call dark energy, and gravity, which would try to pull everything back in. It was just the right balance between those forces to produce stars and matter and galaxies and rocky planets like Earth, a habitat for mankind. If you don't have that perfect balance, you don't get life, you don't get any of this stuff. So to me, it demonstrates God's mastery over the universe and the elements of the universe.
With that, so along those lines, do you think there's any possibility that that perfect balance could have happened randomly? That random sequences of events could have led to us being here today?
It's funny, you use that word random, which I will call out, because engineers, even human engineers, will use random processes to accomplish their purposes.
Mm.
I mean, look at the casino down the road. You've got, and even in engineering, we know that random processes are used sometimes in control systems and things in order to accomplish purposes. So I rather would you allow your question to be rephrased, where instead of using the word random, you use the word accidental, as opposed to on purpose? Then maybe that's what you meant.
Let's rephrase it.
Yeah. Then I think, from an engineer's perspective, when you look at all of the relationships that interacted and then produced something of value, something useful that's needed for the next layer of relationships that needed to happen in order for all of this, the universe, to progress to a state of such complexity and of humans to end up emerging, to me, it's inconceivable that it could have happened accidentally. Now, I suppose one could take that position, but it just, you see, being an engineer, teaching engineering, I know what engineered systems look like. And we call that reverse engineering, when you dissect something to try to understand all the relationships and how it actually works the way it works. So I've written a book actually called Hacking the Cosmos, where I look at reverse engineering the universe to understand all of the relationships that went into the universe today as we see it, and life on Earth today as we know it. And you just see all of these layers of relationships that were needed in order for this to happen. And it produced something of just incredible value. Creatures that are able to know their maker, and creatures are able to love. This is an incredibly powerful result and valuable result that need not have occurred. Yeah. Why would we expect this to occur if there's no mind behind all of this? And if you're not curious as to how it occurred, then I don't think you're being very scientific, because science goes hand in hand with curiosity. And why we have this situation today with human beings emerging in this complex universe should pique our curiosity. And it points to an engineer, a cosmic engineer behind it all.
I remember seeing like videos and research saying that it is mathematically more probable that there is a God than there is no God, because of how low the odds would have been for everything from the beginning of the Big Bang to right now to have happened just accidentally.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting.
I teach a course called The History of Quantitative Thought, where we look at the philosophy and the history of mathematics, and we apply it to try to quantify difficult questions, just as you're talking about. And there's a philosopher of religion who was very famous through the 20th century, Richard Swinburne, who's written 2 books where he applies Bayes' theorem, which is a mathematical equation dealing with probabilities based on conditional evidence. And he shows in his books that if you just look at the natural world and conservatively giving estimates for some of these initial probabilities, he concludes that the probability that God exists is at least 50%. That's being conservative with the numbers. But then his second book, given that result, and now, see, this is called a 2-step apologetic. First, you establish the idea, the reasonableness of the idea of a maker. Then, if that's a reasonable proposition, the second question of importance that he tries to quantify using mathematics is, what do you do with the resurrection of Jesus Christ? In a historical event that you've got certain facts about that resurrection that cry out for explanation. And so he applies the evidence to that using Bayes' theorem as well. And there he comes out with a result I think is 97% probable that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, did actually rise from the dead and was the Son of God. So I think I love teaching that course because I think Swinburne is very highly respected. He was an Oxford professor, and he does a very good job of presenting the evidence in a very reasonable and rational way.
I think it's really interesting, like the perspective we've kind of gotten to have with interviewing a few different professors for this process just keeps showing over and over again that, like, no matter what scientific field you choose to look through, there's always it always kind of points back to God. And that's the beauty of it. Like everything you're saying right now, biology, physics, math, no matter the lens you choose to put on, you can always find a way back to God and back to what we say is the truth, right?
Right.
And I think that's amazing.
Yeah. And whether you're talking about biology or chemistry or even the humanities, it all demonstrates, in my mind, that it was engineered to be that way. So engineering is at the foundation of it all.
Good.
That's funny.
I may be biased.
Just a little bit. I'm just kidding. I think I have a question just about, how we're talking about Genesis and how things could have been misinterpreted at the time. Like you're saying the word yom. I know the word for father is the same word as forefather in Hebrew, I think. And so like when they're talking about descendants,
The ancestry.
yeah, they could have been talking about his grandfather or his great-grandfather and not necessarily his father. And so maybe when that was calculated, it might have been calculated wrong.
That's a good point, because we do have genealogies that appear to be complete.
Yeah.
And they would seem to indicate a much younger Earth, or at least a much younger time from Adam. But you're right. Those could be incomplete. They could have been talking about the ancestor, not necessarily the father.
Yeah. So with all of that in mind, do you think it's also possible that something that I've heard a lot, a theory that I've heard a lot, is that when looking at it through the perspective of a 6-day creation, do you think it would have been possible that God created things with age? Because I know lots of people say they don't think Adam and Eve were created as babies.
Right.
Or
and then
it was like seed in the ground.
So if they were created as adults, they would look like they have
an age.
An age, yeah.
And same with animals and flowers and plants.
Right.
And the earth and then stars.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. The only reason I'm a little uncomfortable with that idea is that God created everything with the appearance of age, is that it kind of doesn't seem to fit with God's straightforward and honest nature. That when he speaks of the creation in the Bible even, he talks about how it declares faithfully his glory and the processes that were used in creation. So that's ultimately, I think, what young earth creationists have to resort to, and if they're engaging in apologetics with skeptics, they would say, well, things were created with the appearance of age. And I'm not going to say that's wrong. That's a possibility. But I do want Christian young people to know that there are other possibilities too. And I think those other possibilities fit better with the scientific evidence. The other thing about that creation with the appearance of age is when you look at the complexity of all of these things that seem to corroborate together on the age of the earth being old and the age of the universe being old, it seems like God has gone to great lengths to almost deceive us into thinking about that they're not really what they appear to be.
Yes.
And that's just doesn't seem to fit his nature.
He's not deceptive.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're saying that it's possible that Genesis could have been misinterpreted, or that we're not fully understanding, that part of the Bible, do you think it's possible that more of the Bible is misinterpreted? So where would you draw the line with that?
You should understand that not all Christians throughout the ages have held to a young earth creationist view. There have been Christians throughout the ages who held to an older earth or even an infinite age for the universe. In fact, this young earth creationist approach became popular after Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, I'm not saying there weren't Christians who believed in a young earth before Darwin, but it wasn't across the board. There were different views on it. With regard to the rest of the Bible, and this is something I think that the Christian church has maybe gotten wrong a little bit recently, is that they asked this question, and there was a movie done recently, is Genesis history? That question, I think, is a little bit ill-posed because Genesis is a rather big book, 40, 50 chapters or whatever, and it has different accounts in it. So to ask the question about the whole book being history, I think we need to look at each of the accounts within it and see, okay, what is the genre of that account? What is it? Is it poetic or is it historical? And we have to do that with all the books of the Bible, all the accounts within the books, because within some books you might have some poetry and some history, and so that's why up front I mentioned how it's easy for us to interpret the resurrection accounts, the gospel accounts, because those are obviously historical accounts. It's easy for us to interpret Paul's letters because we know who he was writing to, we know the purpose of his writing,
Right.
and so that's correspondence, that's letters, and so we interpret those where we would interpret letters at that time, knowing the culture and everything. So just because we might recognize an error in interpretation among some Christians in Genesis doesn't mean that we've interpreted all the Bible wrongly. You have to look at each book, and even within each book, even sub-accounts within each book, you have to look at them.
They're all written differently, so you can't just extrapolate an idea of I can interpret everything the way I want. There are some things that are clear as day, and then there's some things that kind of leave the room for thinking.
Right, and so people will ask me, how should I interpret the Bible? Should I interpret it literally? Should I interpret it figuratively?
Yeah.
Well, the answer to that question is you should interpret it as the author intended it. So there you have to do the hard work of biblical scholarship and hermeneutics and understanding the author's intent and the purpose of the writing of that particular passage. Who was he writing to? What was the culture within it was writing, and what was God trying to communicate through that, because we believe in the inspiration of Scripture. But he used human authors at particular times and places and cultures, and we have to understand all of that to understand what was being communicated and how to interpret that piece of Scripture.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so kind of the conclusion for this idea is there are other possible options out there, and not to refute scientific evidence or not to refute what science may be pointing towards, being open to the fact that maybe your truth is not the real truth, but it can still fit within like a biblical interpretation, right?
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do with this podcast too, is the idea of keep challenging what you believe. Don't be afraid. God is not afraid of your questions. We believe in the biblical truth, but the way it happened may be a bit different than how we understand it. We're only human. So it's like you're saying, part of the process of discovery is this, like it's the beauty of
questions.
it. Yeah.
And we do believe that science, like you said, science is so beautiful because it gives us the ability to ask questions and to discover things. And there's so much joy in knowing things and understanding things. But that doesn't mean that, the Bible and science contradict each other. I think that they do run in parallel. We just don't necessarily understand everything. Because we can't. I don't think we can fully understand everything. But we can try. We can try our best to ask the right questions. And
once you become a parent and you have children and they begin to discover things in the world and learn things, it's such a joy as a parent. And I think God, he's given us this parental analogy where he's our father. I think he enjoys the fact that we get to uncover the mysteries of the universe and discover him through that.
Yeah, that's so cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Hosmer, for agreeing to do this interview with us.
Sure.
We'll go back to our audience members and just say, remember to keep challenging what you believe. This is exactly kind of the theme of today's topic. Keep challenging what you believe, and we'll see you guys in the future episode.
Bye. Hey guys, thanks for taking the time to engage with us. All of our contents can be found on the following platforms.
If you enjoy our content, remember to like and comment. Also, if you have a question of your own, you can send it to us through Instagram DMs. We'll try to answer all of the questions to the best of our abilities. All questions will be kept anonymous.
If you found this video helpful, please be sure to share it on your story or to share it with your friends. They might find it helpful too.
See you guys soon!